The records room in the lower level of Varda Station smelled like recycled air and old data. Nobody went there voluntarily. The lighting strips along the ceiling had been flickering for 6 months, and the maintenance request had been filed and ignored twice. The room existed because the Galactic Compact required every academy to maintain a physical archive backup. It did not require anyone to actually use it. Nora Calloway used it every day. She sat at the same corner table, third row from the back, with a stack of data chips to her left and a handwritten list of reference codes to her right. She was not particularly tall, not particularly striking, and her academy uniform fit her the way a borrowed jacket fits someone. Functional, not quite right. She had brown eyes that moved quickly across text, and hands that were always slightly ink-stained, even though almost nothing at the academy required actual ink. She had been a cadet at the Interstellar Defense Academy for 14 months. In that time, she had finished in the middle of every combat ranking, near the bottom of every physical endurance test, and at the very top of every written assessment. The written assessments, unfortunately, counted for very little at an institution that valued the first 2 categories considerably more. The Academy was built on Varda Station, a joint installation run by the Galactic Compact, a coalition of 7 species who had agreed, after several centuries of intermittent hostility, to pool their military resources and stop fighting each other long enough to worry about everything else. Humans had been members for 19 years. 19 years was considered very new. The Dorothi, who resembled large armored wolves and moved with the confidence of people who had been winning wars before humans discovered fire, had been members for 400. This context mattered when understanding how most people at the Academy treated Nora. Commander Drell was the primary tactics instructor. He was Dorothi, broad across the shoulders and habitually contemptuous of anything he considered soft. He had a way of walking past Nora's desk during briefings without acknowledging her presence, the way someone walks past furniture. It was not aggressive. It was simply the assumption of irrelevance. Cadet Braille, also Dorothi, was less subtle. He had announced in the mess hall 3 weeks ago, in the flat tone of someone stating obvious fact, that the human scholarship seats existed because the Compact needed to keep its newer members from feeling overlooked. He had looked directly at Nora when he said it. She had looked back at him without expression, finished her meal, and left. The one who was different was Oren. Oren was Cyrene, slender, pale blue, with wide dark eyes and a way of tilting his head when he was thinking that made him look perpetually uncertain even when he wasn't. He had been assigned the bunk 2 doors down from Nora's quarters in the eastern residential block, and he had made the mistake, in his first week, of asking her a genuine question about a history reference she had mentioned in passing. She had answered him with 3 paragraphs of detail he had not expected. After that, he kept asking questions. He was the only one who noticed what she was doing in the archive room. He found her there on a Tuesday, station time, 2 days after the announcement came through that the Outer Rim communications station at Halcyon Drift had gone dark. No distress signal, no final transmission, no debris trail on any surrounding sensor net. Just silence where there had previously been regular check-ins. The announcement caused significant disruption in the upper levels of the Academy. Instructors were called into meetings. Senior cadets with field ratings were summoned for fast-track deployment review. The common rooms buzzed with theories, equipment failure, pirate activity, a compact rival testing boundaries. In the archive room, Nora was very still. Oren sat down across from her. He looked at the chips stacked to her left. There were 14 of them, each one labeled in her handwriting with a location name and a date. Halcyon Drift was not among them. "You heard?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "What do you think happened?" She did not answer immediately. She was looking at the reference list in front of her, and she drew a small mark next to one of the codes. Then she looked up. "I think the same thing that happened to the other 14, she said. He looked at the chips. "Other 14 what?" She tapped the stack once with her finger. "Stations. Outposts. Mining installations. 1 agricultural relay. All went dark. All were recovered. Eventually. Empty, undamaged, no trace of attack, no bodies. Spread across 60 years of compact history and about 20 years of pre-compact independent records." She paused. Nobody connected them because they were filed under 8 different agencies across 4 species archives. and because the time gaps between each incident were long enough that whatever working group was assigned to the previous one had dissolved before the next one happened. Oren stared at her. How did you connect them? I was writing a thesis, she said simply, on pre-compact contact events. I needed to cross-reference across species archives. So I did. He looked at the chips again, then back at her. You think Halcyon Drift is number 15. It will be confirmed as number 15 when the fleet arrives and finds nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Outside in the corridor, they could hear the distant noise of cadets being organized, senior voices giving directions, the station's general tension transmitting itself through walls and floors. You should report this, Oren said. I have, she said. Her voice did not change. 4 times. In the last 3 months. He blinked, and she turned back to her reference list. The first report was redirected to the Historical Research Division, which thanked me and filed it. The second was reviewed by a junior analyst in the Strategic Planning Office who noted it was interesting but outside his clearance scope. The third was returned with a comment that I should route it through my faculty supervisor. The fourth, she stopped. She reached across the table and turned one of the data chips over so he could see the small printed label on the back. It read, Return to Sender. Incomplete submission format. The format was correct, she said. I checked it 4 times. Oren looked at the chip and then at her face. Her expression was the same as it always was. Calm. Watching. What are you going to do, he asked. She picked up a new data chip from a small case beside her reference list. She slotted it into the terminal in front of her, and a blank document opened on the screen. I'm going to write it again, she said. But this time I need to find out something first. She scrolled through the archive index on her screen, moving quickly through categories he could barely read in the flickering light. He waited. She stopped scrolling. There it is, she said very quietly, to no one in particular. She looked at the entry for a long time. Then she opened the blank document and began to write. Oren sat across from her in the dim, flickering room, listening to the station hum around them. And he had the particular feeling of someone who has just realized they are sitting very close to something important without fully understanding what it is yet. Above them, through 3 floors of corridor and common room and command deck, Varda Station prepared to send its finest into the dark after a mystery they had already decided was simple. Nora wrote, The departure of the Compact Response Fleet was the kind of event that filled corridors and viewing decks with noise. Cadets pressed against observation glass. Senior officers walked quickly and spoke in clipped, important-sounding sentences. Commander Drell gave a short address on the upper deck that no one had asked him to give, but that he delivered anyway, his broad chest forward, his voice carrying the natural authority of a species that had been conquering things for centuries. He spoke about readiness. He spoke about the Compact's strength. He mentioned the Dorothi contribution to the fleet by name. He did not mention the 3 human cadets who had made the deployment list, not by omission born of malice, but by the simpler and more complete oversight of never having thought to include them. The fleet was impressive to look at. 9 vessels, ranging from the heavy Dorothi frigate at the front to the fast Cyrene reconnaissance craft flanking it on both sides. They moved out of Varda Station's docking arms with the slow, deliberate grace of large things that know they are being watched. Nora watched from the observation deck at the far east end of the station. It was the less popular deck, smaller viewport, no seating, a persistent vibration in the floor from the atmospheric recyclers below. She stood with her hands loosely at her sides and watched the fleet until the last ship's running lights were small enough to be mistaken for distant stars. Oren found her there because by now he had a reasonable sense of where she would be when she wasn't in the archive room. You could have argued, he said. He stood beside her, close enough to speak quietly. Your assessment scores are in the top 4% of the cadet body. You could have gone to Drell or to Voss and made a case for inclusion. The deployment list was closed 6 days ago, she said. Arguing after the list is closed is just noise. You knew 6 days ago you weren't going to be on it? I knew 6 days ago when the criteria for the list were posted. Field rating, combat assessment, species standard endurance threshold. She glanced at him briefly. I don't meet the last one. Human endurance metrics don't map to compact field standards yet. The committee that was supposed to propose an adjusted scale hasn't met in 8 months. He thought about this. Below the observation deck, The station was returning to its ordinary rhythm. The noise of departure was already fading. People were going back to what they had been doing before the fleet arrived and before the fleet left. Do you think the fleet will find them? Oren asked. The people at Halcyon Drift. No, she said. She said it the way someone says a thing they have already accepted. They'll find the station intact. Systems operational, logs running up until a specific point, then nothing. No sign of attack. No sign of evacuation. No bodies. The personal effects of the crew will still be in their quarters. Food in the preparation units. Lights on. He felt the skin on his arms react to that image in the way that Cyrene's skin reacted to discomfort. A faint ripple, a cooling. Like they were simply no longer there, she said. Yes. He turned to look at her directly. Nora, how do you know that's what the station will look like? You said the other incidents were documented, but I've never seen those files. I've never heard anyone at this academy mention them. She reached into the front pocket of her uniform and held out a small data chip. He took it. Those are condensed summaries, she said. 14 incidents. Different names, different species, different filing categories. The Dorothi filed their 2 cases under unexplained military loss. The Cyrene filed theirs under anomalous navigation zone. Humans, before the compact, filed the one that overlaps with their pre-membership records under the category missing vessel, presumed environmental. Nobody used the same language for the same thing. He turned the chip over in his fingers. But you recognize them as the same thing. I was looking at all the archives at once, she said. That's the only reason I could see the shape of it. No one working inside one species' filing system would have caught it. The gaps were too wide and the language was too different. He looked at the chip, then put it carefully in his own pocket. He would read it tonight. He already knew, from her tone, that it would change how he understood the situation. What did they have in common? He asked. The 14 locations. She turned back to the viewport. The place where the fleet had been was just open space now. They all sat on deposits of Varanite-7, she said. It's a rare isotope, found in certain planetary crusts under specific pressure conditions. Most species know about it. It has minor industrial uses, nothing dramatic. The compact doesn't track it carefully because no one's ever found a reason to. It's not a fuel source. It's not a weapon component. It's just there, in certain rocks, in certain places. He thought for a moment. And someone is targeting those places. Not someone, she said. Something. And targeting implies intent in the way we understand it. I'm not certain intent is the right frame. She stopped, as if choosing her next words carefully. The Surith had a name for it. The Surith were a pre-compact species, gone now, reasons unrelated to this. They wrote about it in their contact records. They called it a harvester. Their word, translated. They described it as large, slow, and entirely indifferent. It did not come for them. It came for what was in the ground beneath them. The recyclers below hummed their steady vibration through the floor. The Surith documented a diversion, she said. They moved, sent a stronger Varanite-7 signal from a secondary location. The thing followed the stronger signal. They survived. Oren was very still. You have this in writing? A surviving record? Volume 4 of the Surith Peripheral Contact Logs. Pre-Compact Archive, Section R, Subsection 11. It's been in the lower archive for 30 years. No one has accessed it since it was digitized. She glanced at him. I accessed it the day before yesterday. I'm the first log entry in 3 decades. He exhaled slowly. Nora, you have a potential solution. You have documentation. You have historical precedent. Why isn't anyone? He stopped himself, because he knew part of the answer. I filed the 5th report this morning, she said. Different channel. I'll tell you about it when there's more to tell. When the fleet gets back from Halcyon Drift with nothing, she said, and whatever this is decides where it's going next. She said it quietly, without drama, the way a person states a schedule they have already worked out in their head. He looked at her standing at the smaller viewport with the empty space in front of her and the flickering corridor behind, and he understood something he had been trying to understand for weeks. She wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she had been talking and no one had been listening, and she had made a decision not to waste her remaining energy on people who were not ready to hear it yet. She was waiting. Not for permission, not for recognition. She was waiting for events to get far enough along that the people who controlled the decisions would have no choice left but to use the one she had already prepared. Oren looked at the data chip in his pocket. Outside, in the dark that the fleet was moving through, something very old and very large was already moving too. It had no awareness of fleets or academies or species coalitions. It had no opinion of the light coming out of Varda Station's viewports. It simply moved, the way it had always moved, toward the thing it needed. In 11 days, it would arrive. Nora already knew where. There is a particular kind of silence that a document makes when it has been read and set aside by someone who does not intend to act on it. It is not a loud silence. It does not announce itself. It simply settles into the gap between what was written and what was done, and it sits there. Nora had come to recognize that silence very well over the past 3 months. The automated response to her 5th report arrived 2 days after the fleet departed. It came from the Strategic Planning Office, which was technically not the office she had sent it to. She had sent the 5th report through the Compact's Civilian Infrastructure Alert System, a channel primarily used by supply coordinators and environmental safety officers, because the civilian system had a different routing path than the military one, and because it bypassed the 3 mid-level filtration points that had caught and quietly buried the previous 4. The automated response told her that her environmental flagging of the moon Kel-4 had been received and forwarded to the Resource Management Division for standard review, which would take between 10 and 20 working days. She had expected this. She had also expected the knock on her door from Commandant Voss's administrative secretary the following morning, informing her that the commandant would see her at his discretion on the matter of an improperly routed cadet report. She thanked the secretary and confirmed she would be available at any time. Commandant Voss was old, by Cyrene standards, which meant he moved carefully and said very little that was not deliberate. His office was on the 3rd level, with a proper viewport that faced starward rather than station inward. He sat behind a desk that held a single active screen and nothing else, and he looked at Nora the way he looked at most things, with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to know that most situations resolve themselves if you waited. "You filed a report through the civilian infrastructure system," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "You flagged a mining moon for environmental review." "Yes." "And this is connected," he said slowly, "to the 4 previous reports you filed through standard channels. On the subject of," he looked briefly at his screen, "a proposed pattern across historical incident records." "Yes," she said. "I can explain the connection, if you have time." He looked at her for a moment. He had a slight advantage in height, even sitting, the way all Cyrene did, and he used the silence between her sentence and his response in the manner of someone who knew how silence worked. "You have 6 minutes," he said. "The commandant's schedule is not structured for cadets who route documentation through agricultural relay channels." "Understood," she said. She did not use notes. She had not brought any. She spoke for 5 minutes and 48 seconds. She knew exactly how long it was because she had practiced in her quarters the previous night with a timer running. She began with the 14 incidents, not as a list, but as a shape, describing the common factors with the efficiency of someone who has organized the same information many times for an audience that keeps expecting to not find it interesting. She moved to the Varanite 7 correlation, explained why no one had previously connected the sites, and described what the compact fleet would find at Halcyon Drift when it arrived. She described the Surith documentation without excessive detail, established the concept of the diversion as historical fact rather than theory, and closed with the projection. "In 9 days," she said, "something will arrive. Not at Halcyon Drift. At the Varanite 7 deposit closest to the compact's core systems. That deposit is on Kel-4, Varda Station's moon." Voss was quiet. She waited. "You said 9 days," he said finally, "based on the cycle interval documented across the 14 incidents. The average gap between arrival events is 40 years, with a variance of less than 2%. The last event was 40 years ago, at the Surith Colony Outpost in Grid Sector 7. That location is now uninhabited. Kel-4 is the next closest high-density Varanite 7 site in the approach corridor." He looked at his screen. He looked back at her. "You filed this information in 4 previous reports." "Yes." "None of which were acted on." "No." He was quiet again for a moment. "I will refer this to the Senior Strategic Advisory Panel," he said. "That process takes a minimum of For days, she said. I know. That leaves 5 days for preparation. The diversion requires reconfiguring Kel-4's existing mining array to broadcast an amplified Varanite 7 signature. I have already written the technical schematics. I can provide them at any point. He studied her face. You wrote the schematics. Last week. Yes. Before you had official authorization to propose a solution. I wrote them as part of my personal research. Authorization was not required for the writing. The silence in the office after that was a different kind of silence than the one her reports had received. This one was the silence of someone thinking rather than someone dismissing. I will refer it up, he said. You'll hear from my office. She thanked him and stood to leave. Outside in the corridor, Oren was leaning against the wall. He looked up when she appeared. Did he listen? He asked. He didn't walk away, she said, which was how she distinguished between the two. She pulled her personal terminal from her jacket pocket. She had already opened the filing interface before she left the office. She finished the last field as they walked down the corridor together. What is that? Oren asked, looking at the screen. The 6th report, she said. Different channel again. The Compact Mineral Extraction Safety Board. I'm filing Kel-4 for an emergency operational review under the isotope exposure guidelines. She looked at the form for one more second, then submitted it. It's technically about worker safety. The board has an independent action mandate. They don't route through strategic planning. Oren stopped walking. You filed through 3 separate channels. 4, counting the original military ones. At the same time? Staggered. Timed so that each one creates a paper trail with its own timestamp. She put the terminal back in her pocket. If everything goes the way it should, and someone does act before it's too late, I want it on record that the information was available and properly submitted. If nobody acts, she paused, then the timestamps still exist. That matters too, afterward. He started walking again, slowly, processing this. You've been thinking about afterward. I always think about afterward, she said. That's the part where the record gets written. He thought about what she meant by that, and the more he thought about it, the more it stayed with him through the rest of the day. She was not simply trying to stop the thing. She was building something that could not be ignored retroactively, regardless of whether anyone listened in the present. Every report, every channel, every timestamp was a row in a structure that would remain standing even if the moment passed. She was constructing, in the dry language of compact administrative procedure, something that could not be erased. 700 kilometers below Varda Station, on the moon called Kel-4, a mining crew ran standard operations across the Varanite 7 rich crust, pulling modest quantities of the isotope out of the rock in small, careful amounts, the way they had done every day for 11 years without incident. In 9 days, if nothing changed, they would still be there. Nora had no intention of letting nothing change. In her quarters that evening, she opened a new document and began writing a request. It was addressed to the Academy's Logistics Division. It asked for permission to conduct a technical evaluation of Kel-4's mining array on behalf of the academic research program. It cited 2 existing research partnership agreements between the Academy and the Resource Management Division. Both agreements were real. She had found them in the archive 14 months ago, during her first week, reading everything she could find about how Varda Station actually worked. She had wondered, then, whether they would ever be useful. Now she knew. 7 days after the fleet departed, it sent back a transmission. Halcyon Drift was intact. Every corridor pressurized, every system operational, logs running up until a hard stop at the 14th of the month, and then nothing. The personal effects of 112 crew members were in their quarters. The food in the preparation units was still within consumption date. The lights were on. The transmission from Commander Drell's contingent described the find as anomalous and recommended a search and hold posture while the fleet conducted a full sensor sweep of the surrounding space. There was no sign of external attack. No debris, no hull damage, no weapons discharge residue. No bodies. Drell noted in his addendum that the threat had likely been overstated and that the crew had probably been evacuated by an unknown party for reasons that a standard investigation would clarify. Commandant Voss read the transmission at his desk and then pulled up Nora's report on the adjacent screen. He sat with both open for a long time. He sent for her before she could send for him, which meant she was in his office within 8 minutes of the transmission being received. She had, as it turned out, Been in the corridor outside the command floor for the past 2 hours. She did not explain why. He did not ask. The fleet found exactly what you said it would find, he said. Yes, she said. I owe you an apology for not acting sooner. She looked at him steadily. I would rather have your action now than your apology later. He nodded once. The senior panel is convening in 20 minutes. You will present. What followed was the most important 23 minutes of Nora Calloway's time at Varda Station, and she walked into it carrying nothing but her knowledge and a small folded copy of the Surith reference translation she had made by hand in the lower archive 2 nights ago. There were 9 people in the room. Senior officers, 3 species, various ranks. They looked at her with the particular expression that senior people produce when they are asked to listen to someone they have not previously considered worth listening to. 2 of them had their screens open to other work. One, a Dorothi named Sorn, did not look up from his display when she entered. She did not wait for full attention. She began. She did not narrate. She did not soften the information with preamble. She presented the 14 incidents as a grid on the room's central display, each point labeled with location, species, year, and the notation of Varanite 7 presence. She connected the cycle mathematically, walked the panel through the timing, and put Kel-4's coordinates at the center of the projection in bright, clear terms. By the 4th minute, all 9 people were looking at her. By the 10th, 2 of them were forwarding her grid to their own terminals to look at more closely. By the 18th, the room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when the people in them have stopped trying to find the error and have started accepting the shape of what they are seeing. You said diversion is possible, said an officer named Aerith Cyrene, who had been taking notes in the compact shorthand of someone used to managing information quickly. Explain the mechanism. Nora described the Surith method. A controlled broadcast, not a natural isotope presence, but an amplified signal, engineered to read as a higher density Varanite 7 source than the actual deposit. The entity, whatever it was, had no navigation, no decision-making in any meaningful sense. It moved toward the strongest signal of what it needed. It had done so consistently across 60 years of documented approaches and across the entirety of the Surith historical record, which spanned several hundred years of intermittent encounters. Kel-4's mining array, she said, can be reconfigured to broadcast rather than suppress the isotope signature. The array's broadcast power, at maximum, would register to a long-range sensor as approximately 4 times the natural density of the deposit. That would make it the strongest Varanite 7 source in this sector of space. She paused. We broadcast from Kel-4 at the right time, from a location we have cleared of personnel, and the entity goes where we point it. Sorn, who had now fully abandoned his other display, said, You said cleared of personnel. How? The evacuation is already in progress, she said. The room was very still. I filed a civilian environmental safety flag 6 days ago, she said. Kel-4's non-essential personnel have been in staged relocation since then. It is a routine administrative relocation. 70% of the outpost's residential staff have already moved to secondary quarters on Varda Station under the standard isotope exposure protocol, which requires temporary relocation during certain phases of extraction activity. She placed the folded translation on the table. The remaining crew are extraction critical. There are 22 of them. They can be evacuated in approximately 6 hours with standard shuttle rotation. There was a long pause. You started the evacuation, Aerith said slowly, before this meeting. Before this meeting was certain to happen, she said. Yes. The door to the briefing room opened. Commander Drell walked in. He had come back on the fast courier that traveled ahead of the main fleet, carrying the transmission and a contingent of officers for the after-action debrief. He was still wearing his travel coat, which meant he had come directly from the docking arm. He looked at the room, the display with Nora's grid still active on it, the 9 senior officers watching him find his footing, and then he looked at Nora. Who authorized this cadet to brief senior command, he said. His voice was controlled, but only just. Commandant Voss, who had said very little during the briefing, turned his head toward Drell. He said one word. Me. Drell was not a person who backed down easily. He looked at the display again. He looked at Nora's grid. Each of the 14 points marked clearly, the projection lines leading to Kel 4 with the kind of precision that was difficult to argue against in a room full of people who could read data. He said nothing for a moment. Nora did not watch his face. She was looking at the display, checking the cycle projection, calculating the time remaining against the evacuation schedule in her head. "You have 2 days," Aerith said to her, "to complete the evacuation and reconfigure the array. Is that achievable?" "Yes," she said. "I have the schematics. I need a technical team of 4 and access to Kel 4's array control interface." "Done," said Voss. Drell sat down. He did not speak for the rest of the meeting. He looked at the grid for a long time with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. Outside Varda Station, the sensors were already tracking the anomaly. It had appeared on the long-range net 6 hours ago, too large to be a ship, too slow to match any known vessel class, moving with the patient, terrible certainty of something that had never in its existence needed to hurry. The Compact's tactical database had no record of it. Nora's handwritten translation of a dead species contact log had a full description. She looked at it once more before she left the room. The single line she had underlined in the archive, translated from Surith into Compact standard in her own careful handwriting. "It does not know we are here. It has never needed to." She folded it, put it in her pocket, and went to find her team. Kelfor was not a beautiful moon. It had no weather, no water on its surface, and a sky that looked the same at all hours. A pale gray-brown expanse of thin atmosphere through which Varda Station was always visible as a distant, bright shape. The ground was flat and dry, broken up in long stripes by the mining equipment that had been installed 11 years ago when the Varanite 7 deposits were first mapped. The outpost buildings were low and functional, built to be useful and nothing else. Nora found it entirely acceptable. She had not come for the view. Her team arrived on the first shuttle. Herself, Oren, 2 human engineers named Rael and Das who worked in the Academy's Technical Training Division and had been lent out on the Commandant's direct instruction, and a Cyrene Systems specialist named Fane who had read Nora's schematic in the briefing room and spent the entire shuttle descent asking her increasingly technical questions that she answered without looking up from her notes. The remaining 22 extraction crew were notified, loaded onto the second shuttle, and off Kel 4 within 4 hours. The outpost manager, a Dorothi named Prath who had lived on the moon for 7 years, was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway of the outpost's main control building and looked at Nora. "You're certain about this?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He looked at the array, the long row of broadcast towers that ran across the flat ground in a line toward the eastern ridge, designed to suppress and contain the isotope signature during standard extraction. She was going to turn them into something else. "My crew built those towers," Prath said. "They're going to save a lot of lives by not being destroyed," she said. "Which they wouldn't be, if we leave them as they are, and that thing arrives at a populated location instead." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went to the shuttle. The second shuttle lifted. Nora watched it go, and then she went inside and began working. The reconfiguration was not simple, and it was not fast, but it was exactly as she had planned, and planning made the difference. The schematics she had written specified the precise adjustment needed at each of the array's 11 control nodes. Not a full rebuild, but a reorientation of the broadcast field from inward to outward, combined with a power rerouting through Kel 4's geothermal tap that would raise the output to a level far beyond what the array was rated for under normal operations. She had included, in the schematics, a note that the array would likely not survive this process. She had included it because accuracy mattered more than comfort. Rael and Das worked on the physical nodes. Fane managed the power routing interface from the main control board, speaking in a running, quiet technical commentary that Nora listened to and occasionally corrected. Oren handed tools, ran checks, and kept a precise count of the time, announcing it every 20 minutes without being asked because he had learned, over the past weeks, what Nora actually needed from the people around her. 12 hours into the work, the long-range sensor data came through from Varda Station via their communication link. The anomaly had entered the inner approach corridor. It was not decelerating. Fane pulled up the sensor image on the secondary screen in the control room. Everyone stopped working for a moment and looked at it. The thing was hard to see clearly because it was hard for the sensor to categorize, It kept shifting between object classifications as the system tried and failed to match it to anything in its database. It was large, very large. Its surface, if surface was even the right word, moved in a way that was not mechanical. It moved the way a living thing moves when it is breathing, except the scale of it made breathing seem like the wrong comparison too. The sensors estimated its width at approximately 9 kilometers. 9 kilometers, Das said, very quietly. The Surith estimated 12, Nora said, and went back to her node. They had a narrow window. The diversion would only work if the broadcast was active before the entity came within close approach range, roughly 40,000 kilometers, because the Surith records indicated the entity made its final course lock at that distance. After course lock, a stronger signal from a different direction might not be sufficient to redirect it. Nora calculated their remaining time and put it in her head the way she put everything important, clearly labeled, accessible, not to be confused with anything else. She told her team how long they had. She told them once, in plain terms, without urgency in her voice. They worked faster. With 2 hours remaining before the close approach threshold, Fane announced the power routing was complete. Rail and DOS closed and sealed the last 2 nodes. Nora ran a full verification check on the control board, going through each confirmation point methodically, not skipping steps because she was in a hurry. Skipping steps because of hurry was how things failed. Everything checked. On my mark, she said. Oren looked at her. She looked at the sensor image. The entity was moving the way it always moved, without urgency, without variation, utterly certain of its destination the way all things are certain of the things they have done for a very long time. Mark, she said. Fane activated the broadcast. The array's 11 towers came to full power simultaneously. The geothermal tap gave everything it had. 3 of the towers, pushed beyond their rated limits, began showing stress indicators on the secondary display immediately. Nora watched the numbers and did nothing about the stress indicators, because the purpose of the array now was not to survive, it was to be loud. The Varanite 7 signal that went out from Kel 4 in that moment was 4 times stronger than any natural deposit in the sector. On any sensor system that could read isotope frequencies, it would register like a beacon. On the sensor display, the entity's course held straight for 11 more seconds. Then it shifted. Not dramatically. It did not wheel or lurch or change direction the way a ship does when it receives a navigation command. It moved the way a very large animal moves when it catches a scent, a slow, gradual reorientation, more like a lean than a turn, the whole massive shape of it angling toward the stronger source. Away from Varda Station. Toward Kel 4. Nora looked at the trajectory projection, confirmed the course, and then looked at the time. Shuttles, she said. They left in an ordered way, not running, moving with the focused efficiency of people who had checked the schedule and knew they had enough time if they did not waste it. The outpost was already locked down. There was nothing to take. They went to the single remaining shuttle on the landing pad, boarded, and lifted before the first tower failed. 2 more failed on the ascent. Through the shuttle's rear viewport, Nora watched the array begin to break apart under the strain, tower by tower, the broadcast becoming louder and more erratic as the system pushed beyond every safety threshold it had been built with. It was still broadcasting when they cleared atmosphere. It would keep broadcasting until it couldn't anymore. That was all it needed to do. The shuttle was 40 minutes out from Kel 4 when the entity arrived. On the shuttle's small sensor display, lower resolution than the station's, but adequate, they watched it descend. The sheer scale of it against Kel 4's surface made the moon look briefly, terribly small. And then it was simply there, pressing against the rock, and the sensor readings from Kel 4's surface went irregular and then quiet as the moon gave up the thing it had held for a long time. It took 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, the entity lifted. Its course recalculated in the direction it had always ultimately been heading. Back into deep space, back along its long path, following the cycle that it had been following for longer than any species currently alive in the compact had been watching the stars. It did not acknowledge Varda Station. It did not acknowledge the shuttle. It did not acknowledge anything, because it had never needed to. Oren let out a long breath. Rail and Da sat with their hands on their knees and said nothing for a while. Fane was already running a diagnostic on the shuttle's secondary systems. which was simply what Fane did when he needed to do something with his hands. Nora sat in the front right passenger seat and watched the entity's sensor trace move away on the small display. She watched it until it was at the edge of the shuttle's sensor range. Then she looked at the window and at the stars beyond it. "Nora," Oren said. "Yes," she said. "You did it." She thought about this for a moment in the way she thought about most things, honestly, without embellishment. "We did it," she said, meaning the team, because it was true. Then she was quiet. After a while she said, "I would like to sleep for about 3 days." Nobody argued with her. Behind the shuttle, in the direction opposite the entity's departure, Varda Station glowed steadily in the dark, whole, populated, entirely unaware of how close the choice had been and how long one person had been working to make sure it came out the way it did. The shuttle flew on, and the dark was quiet, and in the quiet, very far away, something old continued its patient journey through the space between stars, not knowing and not needing to know that this time, for the first time in a very long while, something small and determined had moved before it arrived. 31 days after the shuttle returned from Kel-4, the Compact's formal inquiry began. It was held in the station's mid-level conference room, not the grand assembly hall that some of the senior officers had expected. Commandant Voss had made that decision specifically, on the reasoning that the grander the room, the more the language of the inquiry would shift toward theater and away from fact. He wanted fact. Nora sat at the inquiry table in her cadet uniform. She had been offered the use of an analyst's formal jacket for the occasion by the station's administrative office. She had thanked them and declined. The people doing the inquiry knew who she was. The jacket would not clarify anything. The inquiry had 3 purposes: to establish what had happened, to determine whether any regulations had been violated, and to decide whether any corrective action was needed. The Compact's inquiry board was made up of 2 officers from strategic planning, a Dorothi legal representative, and a Cyrene administrative jurist named Vel, who had been assigned to the case from the Compact's Central Records Division and who had, Nora noticed, already read all 6 of her reports before arriving, based on the page marks visible in the physical copy he had brought to the table. She appreciated that. The inquiry proceeded methodically, which Nora appreciated even more. Each step was documented, each statement entered into the record with its source and timestamp, each point of procedure checked against the relevant Compact Charter section. It was, in its way, the same kind of work she did in the archive, taking scattered pieces and building them into a structure that would hold its shape. Her 6 reports were entered into the record in full. The timestamps were noted. The routing paths were mapped, which channel each report had traveled, who had received it, what had been done with it, and when. This part of the process was uncomfortable for several people in the room, not because anyone had acted in bad faith, but because the pattern of what had happened to the information was difficult to look at once it was laid out cleanly. Report received. Report filed. Report redirected. Report returned. Report received. Report filed. 6 times, in 3 months, the information had been in the system. The system had not responded. The inquiry did not assign individual blame for this. It noted the pattern as a structural finding. This was the appropriate approach, and Nora had expected it. What she had not expected, or had not let herself expect, because expecting things that depended on other people's choices was a habit she had learned to moderate, was Commander Drell's statement. He had been called to give a senior officer's account of the fleet's findings at Halcyon Drift and his subsequent return. He gave the account accurately. He did not minimize the finding or reframe it. He described the empty station with the same flat precision that characterized all his speech. He noted that the station's condition matched Cadet Calloway's prediction exactly. He noted that he had entered the briefing room on Varda Station during her presentation to the senior panel and had heard her solution proposed. He noted that the solution had been executed successfully with 0 loss of life. Then he stopped speaking for a moment. The room waited. "I underestimated the cadet," he said. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize in the way that species who use apology as a social ritual apologize. He said it the way Dorothi say things that they mean, simply, completely, without decoration, as a statement of observed fact. He looked at Nora across the table. In Dorothi tradition, there was a word used when a warrior formally acknowledged that another had performed an act of notable ability. It was not a word for equals. It was a word from a tradition of hierarchy, which made it carry a particular weight when a senior said it to a junior. He said it once, quietly. Nora heard it. She did not make a ceremony of it. She nodded once, precisely, which was the correct response and which she had read about in a Dorothy cultural reference text she had found in the archive in her second month at the academy. She had read it the way she read everything, because it was there, because it might matter eventually, because the habit of reading things that other people had decided were irrelevant had never once failed her. The inquiry's findings, issued 4 days later, were as follows. Nora Calloway had not violated any compact regulation. Each channel she had used for her 6 reports was a legitimate filing pathway, correctly applied. The environmental safety flag was technically accurate. The logistics access for the Kel 4 technical visit was properly authorized through existing research partnership agreements. The variance waiver for the array reconfiguration had been filed through the correct administrative body and backdated within legally acceptable parameters. Every step she had taken was within the letter of the compact charter, applied in a sequence that no one had previously thought to use in combination. The inquiry also noted, as a separate structural finding, that the compact's multi-species archive system required a cross-referencing protocol to prevent the kind of information fragmentation that had allowed 15 identical incidents to go unconnected for 60 years. Commandant Voss signed the structural finding himself. He transmitted it to the compact's Central Records Division with a personal annotation that the proposed cross-referencing system should be implemented with priority clearance and operational within 1 year. The protocol was given a name, without ceremony, by the administrative officer who processed the paperwork. She needed to enter a name for the system into the filing index, and she used the simplest available option. She called it the Calloway Index. Nora learned about this from Orrin, who had heard it from Fane, who had read the administrative bulletin. She said nothing in response to the news. She looked at the table in front of her and was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter to you?" Orrin asked. "It matters that it exists," she said. "That's the part that matters." Orrin had, in the interim, filed a formal request to be added to Nora's academic thesis advisory track, the research-focused strand that most cadets treated as a secondary route for people who weren't strong enough for field deployment. He told her directly, which was the Cyrene way, that she was the only person at the academy who read things that other people had decided did not require reading, and that he believed this was exactly the skill the compact needed more of. She thought about this and then said, "You'll have to read a lot of things that seem boring at first." "Yes," he said. "The Dorothy expedition logs from the second compact expansion period are particularly difficult. Very long sentences." "I'll manage," he said. "All right," she said. Life on Varda Station returned to its ordinary shape. Senior officers moved through the corridors with purpose. Cadets drilled and assessed and argued about deployment rankings. Commander Drell taught tactics with the same authority he had always projected, and if his manner toward the human cadets in his sessions was different in some small, imprecise way, more acknowledgement, less furniture, most people did not notice or did not remark on it. In the lower archive, the flickering light strips were finally replaced. A maintenance ticket had been submitted by an anonymous party who knew the exact reference number for the replacement components and had appended the request to an existing work order in a way that guaranteed it would be processed that same week. The archive room was brighter now, and the hum from the recyclers below was the same as it had always been. Nora sat at the same corner table, third row from the back. New stack of data chips to the left. New handwritten list of reference codes to the right. A cup of something that was technically in the same category as coffee, gone cold because she had stopped paying attention to it. The screen in front of her showed the compact's expanded archive. Not just the military records, not just one species filing system, but the broad cross-referenced catalog that the Calloway Index was already beginning to connect. There were large parts of it that no one had looked at seriously in decades. Some of it had never been cross-referenced with anything. She was looking at pre-compact deep space observation records from 3 separate species, collected across 4 centuries. She was looking for a shape in them, the kind of shape that only became visible when you looked at everything at once. She found something in the 47th minute. She looked at it for a long time. She pulled up the adjacent records, cross-checked the positioning data, verified the timestamps. She opened a new document and began writing. Whatever it was in the records, whatever pattern she had found in the quiet data that no one had been watching, she did not say it aloud. She did not tell Oren yet, and she did not make any immediate report. She wrote carefully, checked her sources, and when she reached the end of what she could confirm that evening, she saved the document, closed the archive, and left the room. The station was dim in its night cycle. The corridors were mostly empty. She walked back to her quarters without hurry. Outside the station, in the direction the harvester had come from, the deep space was full of the kind of silence that looks like emptiness but isn't. The harvester moved through it on its long, slow path back to wherever it would feed next. It did not know what had happened at Kelfor in any sense that mattered. But further out than the harvester, beyond it, past it, in the older and quieter dark where the light from Varda Station was too faint to be detected by any instrument on the station itself, something else was out there, moving at a different pace, on a different cycle. Nora did not know yet what it was. She had only the beginning of the shape, the suggestion of a pattern in 4 centuries of records that 3 species had separately observed and separately filed and separately decided were probably nothing. She was going to read all of it. She had time. She always had time, because she had never once wasted it on waiting to be asked.